When leaders from the United States and China stand together for diplomatic photo ops, the cameras capture polite smiles and firm handshakes. But if you watch closely, those highly choreographed moments mask a different reality. You are watching an active, quiet transfer of global dominance, where two rivals probe each other for weaknesses before a very long fight. This animated timeline visualizes the Thucydides trap. The flat line represents an established superpower like the United States. The rising curve is a rapidly growing challenger like China. When these lines meet at this intersection, history suggests severe conflict becomes a mathematical certainty. This modern theater of war operates through the control of invisible economic levers and global resource choke points, far removed from the infantry lines of the 20th century. As these two massive economies lock into a state of total combat, it raises an immediate question for the rest of the globe. Where exactly does this leave a historically non-aligned nation of 1.4 billion people like India? Finding that answer requires looking past traditional metrics like military size toward a new architecture of influence, mathematically critical geopolitical leverage. To understand how leverage actually works, we can look at how China neutralized American aggression. When the U.S. attempted to assert dominance by slapping heavy tariffs on Chinese goods, Beijing launched a hyper-targeted economic strike right at the heart of American agriculture. This endless stretch of green crops represents one of America's most vulnerable exports, soybeans. China completely halted their purchases of American soybeans overnight. The move was designed to bankrupt specific American farming communities, forcing a wave of intense domestic political pressure straight onto U.S. leadership. The United States then tried to squeeze China's access to energy. By heavily sanctioning major oil producers like Iran and Venezuela, the U.S. intended to starve Chinese industry of the fuel it needs to function. But this map of China's Shandong province reveals how Beijing countered. Notice these small, scattered nodes separate from the massive state-owned hubs. These are called teapot refineries. They are small, independent operations that act entirely outside the official purview of the central government. As we map the flow of crude oil into these specific independent nodes, you'll see a distinct currency symbol. These teapot refineries purchase Iranian oil using the Chinese yuan, bypassing the US dollar. Because the transactions never touch the American financial system, the US sanctions hold zero weight. China maintains its position on the global board by engineering untraceable, localized bypasses that render direct American pressure ineffective. This leads into the third leverage point, rare earth minerals. These are the specific ingredients required to build everything from smartphones to advanced fighter jets. Look at the extreme asymmetry in this block chart. China doesn't just mine these minerals, they control 90% of the world's capacity to refine them into usable materials. The rest of the globe shares that tiny remaining sliver. As this chart dissolves into the internal schematic of a modern missile, the geopolitical irony becomes clear. The United States relies on high-tech weaponry to project power across the globe, but its defense contractors lack the internal domestic supply chains required to build the internal guidance systems. The American military currently relies on Chinese state-backed suppliers for the raw components needed to manufacture the very weapons intended to counter Chinese expansion. The United States cannot forcefully dominate a rival that has meticulously engineered itself to be a mathematically indispensable piece of the American war machine. This pile of Indian rupee notes reflects how the global establishment categorizes India, a massive consumer market and a reservoir of low-cost labor. It is a role defined by consumption rather than strategic influence. The reality of the Thucydides trap is that any nation lacking its own leverage will become a subordinate asset to whichever superpower ultimately wins the economic clash. To break out of this categorization, India has to identify and weaponize its own advantages. The strongest immediate candidate is its rapidly expanding space sector. India currently operates the most cost-efficient launch programs on the planet, supported by an ecosystem of over 400 private space startups. The global demand for satellite and communication infrastructure is exploding, and India has a brief window to capture that demand. Mastering high-tech space delivery provides a path to upgrade India's global identity. It transitions the country from a passive consumer market into a sovereign utility provider that other nations rely on to function. The second major lever requires achieving true economic independence. India must move beyond offering high volume to the world and start demanding high value. You can see the foundation of this strategy in this simple action: a smartphone scanning a UPI QR code. By aggressively scaling this domestic digital infrastructure, India has built a system capable of bypassing Western financial dominance, creating a viable global alternative to legacy networks like SWIFT. The next logical step is expanding the RuPay network to directly compete with Visa and MasterCard. If India can establish the rupee as a functional reserve currency in neighboring economies, like Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka, it physically insulates the region from American dollar sanctions. But before any of this power can be projected outward, the groundwork has to be secured internally. You cannot challenge global superpowers while dealing with fractured, localized political gridlock and volatile macroeconomic issues at home. International relations operate on a cold truth. There are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. India has the raw materials to build its own architecture of leverage. Now it must choose to make the climb, or accept its place as a permanent pawn in someone else's war.